I'll record it anyway, so we've got recording. Okay, so good morning, everyone. I just wanted to tidy up a couple of points from last topic and then move on to something else. In fact, my focus will be probably be actually around the Shoshan of Vega, even though it was relatively late notice for it. So just to summarize our previous discussion, the Gemara says that the mace, the corpse found on Shabbos, where one needs to protect the corpse from the sun and so on. Basically, the discussion has morphed into a discussion around various solutions to the problem, some of which are off topic, not our core sugya of Muktza, and some of which are on topic and are connected to Hilchos Muktza. So one suggestion, one way of dealing with the mace was by bringing things that can create a canopy over the mace or Mechitza, and there were the aspects of Bono, which we're not going to go into, but there are aspects of Hilchos Muktza, which is you're moving something clean nittel, which was really the which is our sugya. That was one solution. The Gemara then came on to the second solution, which is that of rolling the corpse from bed to bed. And the question is, how can you move the corpse, which is Muktza? And the Gemara gets into a discussion of tiltul min hatzad, which either means kilach hayad, shinoi, as per Rashi, or means through something else, as per Rov Rishonim. We then began questioning, okay, with respect to moving the corpse, which is Muktza, I get it, you're moving it indirectly via the bed. However, how can you move the bed? Surely the bed becomes a bossis. The bed becomes Muktza via the corpse and becomes a bossis for the corpse. That was Tosfos' question. Rashi, as the Run points out, avoids the question by saying, no, you're rolling the corpse itself directly, just with a shinoi, indirectly, in an unusual manner. But there are other Rishonim who learn that you're moving the mace by rolling the mace, by tilting the bed from, and thus tilting the mace from bed to bed, even if you're not directly moving the corpse, but you are directly moving a bosses. And as I mentioned last time, every time you want to move indirectly a Muktza item, you have to ask yourself two questions. One is, I'm moving the Muktza item indirectly, is that allowed? And the second thing is, the object I'm using to move it, is that a bossis and therefore Muktza in its own right? So Tosfos resolved this question of bossis by teaching us two principles, two ideas, both linked to the idea of shochach. And Tosfos' basic idea is that something becomes a bossis when you deliberately place it there, but if it is forgotten there, it doesn't become bossis. And therefore Tosfos, by analogy, says that there's two solutions to the mace problem. If the mace died before Shabbos, such that I wanted the mace to be there, it's still not a bossis because I wish to shift the mace off that. And if the mace is died on Shabbos, I didn't deliberately leave a Muktza item on the bed because at the time of Shabbos starting, the mace was alive. I didn't plan to leave a mace there. I didn't want this person to die. And therefore, this is analogous to shochach. I didn't deliberately place it there. We then said, and maybe we shouldn't have looked at the run inside because it became a little bit overwhelming, but these ideas of Tosfos are controversial. And really, it gets down to perhaps a conceptual question of what bossis means. If bossis means that I take a Muktza item, which I'm aware is Muktza, and I place on something else and subsume that something else to its use, and therefore by definition set aside that something else also for a Muktza function, and thus make it Muktza, if that's the concept of bossis, then I understand Tosfos' point that by accidentally, I never did that, because when I left the person there, they were not Muktza, they were a live person, who only later became a dead person. So again, I have my money, my car keys, and I have a little bowl in which I place them. So if the concept of bossis is that I'm placing a Muktza item in the bowl, thus dedicating this bowl to Muktza use, thus setting aside the bowl for non-Shabbos use, I understand why it becomes Muktza. However, if I accidentally, without thinking, put the car keys there and had no plan to leave them there and didn't want them to be there, I didn't set aside the bowl to Muktza use, and therefore it doesn't become Muktza. Now,
yeah. Trying to use the Zoom link and says it doesn't work. I've just tried to join from the link in their email.
So Tosfos is arguing that the concept of bosses is that if I set aside this cereal bowl, yeah, he's come on. I must have started the wrong group. Apologies, Jeffrey. So Tosis is arguing that if I place an object on the in a bowl, apologies, Jeffrey, sorry about that. I think I went onto the wrong group. If I place an object into a okay, fine. Okay, sorry, Henry. Also, sorry, I think I started in the wrong group. Apologies. Okay, so if I place an object, a Muktza item, into a bowl, I'm setting aside this bowl for non-Shabbos use, and that's the concept of bosses of becoming Muktza. Therefore, says Tosfos, if when I placed it in, it wasn't Muktza, and it becomes Muktza on Shabbos, that wouldn't be a bosses. Whether that's a human who dies or a watch that stops, it wasn't Muktza when I placed it, therefore it shouldn't become a bosses. So argues Tosfos. The counter argument is no. The concept of bosses isn't because I'm making the bowl into Muktza. The concept of bosses is that you have something which is there to serve a Muktza item and therefore also set aside for Muktza. So therefore, if I place the item in the bowl at a time when it's not Muktza, it's still a bosses for something. It's a bosses for a non-Muktza item. If this Muktza item then becomes Muktza on Shabbos, it now becomes a bosses for a Muktza item on Shabbos. So just to summarize, Tosfos asks this question of why the mittel isn't a bosses, and he argues that since the mace isn't intended to be left there, or wasn't dead at the time of the start of Shabbos, it doesn't become a bosses, and there's room to argue with that svara. What's interesting is that if you don't accept Tosfos' type of svaras, we also end up with the second stage question, which is, or even with Tosfos' question, when he says, let's say Tosfos gives his answer, he says, I didn't intend to place the dead body there because it was living at the time of the start of Shabbos. Well, I don't understand, that helps with the first mitzvah. But what about with the second mitzvah and the third mitzvah? I'm rolling the dead body from mitzvah to mitzvah. When I move the mace from the first bed to the second bed, I want the mace to, at least temporarily, be on the second bed. I did place the mace deliberately there. So a watered down version of the svara, I think everyone would have to agree with. That everyone would seemingly agree, if I place a Muktza item onto another object with utter intention, it should only be there very short term, temporarily, and my immediate plan is to shove it onto the next item, I think everyone there would agree it's not bosses. So again, I have my mace, I put it onto another bed, but the only reason I want to put it onto the other bed is to roll it onto the next one, the next one, the next one, until I eventually get it to the end. In that case, I think everyone would agree that that's not a bosses. So just to summarize, again, we're trying to avoid being overwhelmed by Hilchos Shabbos, by Muktza over here. The concept of a bosses, everyone agrees, involves some degree of subsuming an under article to the senior article, to the article on top of it. And since I'm subsuming it, it also becomes Muktza. Everyone agrees, therefore, with some version of that if it isn't in any way subsumed, because I want this to be very temporary, or I have no intention of being there, or it's accidentally placed there, it wouldn't become a bosses. And the Machlokes has shown him is exactly how far we take that svara and what the exact boundaries are of that. But everyone agrees that the core idea of bosses is that the bowl upon which I'm placing the Muktza item is subsumed to the Muktza item and becomes Muktza. And broadly speaking, there's two ways of conceptualizing this, either because I'm making it Muktza through the act of placing the object there. I'm setting aside this bowl to be the container for my money and my credit cards and my car keys on Erev Shabbos, and therefore I'm making a Muktza, that's model number one, or model number two is I'm not making a Muktza, I merely want it to contain Muktza items, and therefore by definition becomes Muktza. Those are the two ways we understood this. So we'll move on from this, but I hope that's sort of a reasonable summary of where we're up to in our thinking. What I want to do sorry, yeah.
Just mention that.
Yeah. Yes.
Thanks for bringing this whole bosses into the discussion. So just says, Amai Asa Rav Papa Chiltulin Asad.
Yes.
It's not bosses. It seems to be saying if it were a bosses, that would be an excuse to be Isa Chiltulin Asad. He's not saying if it's a bosses, we've got a problem with bosses. He's saying if you've got a bosses, we've got a problem with Chiltulin Asad.
It's an unclear Tosfos. The language of Tosfos is unclear. But the only way one can seemingly understand it is that that allowance of tiltul and asad wouldn't make sense over here because there's anyway another problem. But you're correct. It's a good deal in Tosfos. I wish I had a better answer there, but that seems to be the only way. One could conceptualize that the whole logic of tiltul and asad is I'm not directly moving the Muktza item. Whereas with bosses, if it's dedicated to the Muktza item, then that's an alternative way of directly moving the item, which would answer Tosfos' language and be a nice piece of reasoning. The problem is if it's bosses, then there's a more basic reason it should be answered because it's a bosses. So I don't know where to go on with that thought.
We haven't seen anything we've looked at about the temporary nature of you would say makes it not the bosses.
Tosfos doesn't say temporary nature. The Rabbi Zobin brought in the run, the Balamar does. And all I'm saying is that the core idea of very temporary, everyone would agree with. The question is how far one would stretch it.
So, because you said that he was a Das Yochid.
The Rabbi Zobin is a Das Yochid if I intend to put Muktza in a bowl and leave it there for several hours. It appears that everyone would agree if it's merely a second or two of rolling on with no intention. No. But that would, otherwise there's an impossible problem over here, which is as I'm rolling the corpse from bed to bed, for a few seconds it's there. So there the post can say everyone would agree if it's literally, the logic of bosses is because I want the Muktza item on this. But if I don't want the Muktza item on it, I want the mace to be moved on to the next bed, and the next bed, and the next bed. Yeah, no, you're correct. Yeah, no. The chiddush of Rabbi Zobin, which is a Das Yochid, is that if I want the Muktza item on the bowl, but I don't want it to be there for the whole of Shabbos, it's not bosses. Everyone else argues and says, what are you talking about? I want this bowl to carry Muktza, so that's a bosses. For now, it's Muktza. I have plans in the future. Nothing in life is permanent. Right? The whole of life is temporary. So I have a plan to have it there, but it won't be there forever. Fine. So everyone argues with Rabbi Zobin. But where I'm literally, if I'm rolling it from bed to bed, when I ask myself the question, do I want the mace to be on this next bed? No, I don't. I want it to be on the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that. That wouldn't. That everyone would agree would not be a bosses. So, and then the question is how far we extend the principle of bosses. That's true, but there I want the chicks to be on it. The Gemara says I can chase the chicks whenever I want, but there's a reason I put it there because I want it to be a ledge for the chicks to hop up and down onto. So Rabbi Zobin says that's not a bosses because it's temporary. Everyone else says we don't understand what you're talking about, Balamar, because I want the chicks to be there for a time. So that's why I said the Balamar reads the whole of that Omud as one halachic principle. Temporary isn't bosses. So he says exactly your point. The chicks is temporary. Yeah, everyone else argues and says you put it there for a reason because you want the chicks to hop onto this thing. That is what a bosses is. Yeah. So no one in halacha, to the best of my knowledge, Rabbi Zobin does not make any impact on practical halacha in this area. No one thinks that that's enough to stop something being a bosses. In fact, I only want it there for a short time. Half an hour is half an hour, 10 minutes, even 30 seconds is a time. The point with the bed is I don't want it there at all. It's really just a means. It's not, I don't want it there for its own sake. I just want it there to move on to the next place. It's a means, as opposed to the chicken hopping. I want the chicken there for a time. And
number one, it's a means to get to somewhere else. Number two, the means has to be very temporary in nature.
I think they are one condition though. Those two clauses merge into one idea, which is if I ask myself the question, do I want it to be there? The answer is no. I want it to be on from somewhere else. I have no choice but to go by there. If it might not, if I was moving as fast as I could. The point is, do I want it to rest there at all? If it's very heavy and it takes, shall I roll it off the bed and it's there for 10 seconds? I don't think anyone would say that matters. And if it's really heavy and it takes me a minute, I don't think anyone would say it matters. I think the point of temporariness is the Rishonim are arguing of Zachia, saying he's confusing that there's a category error taking place here. Temporary can mean I don't want it there long term, I want it short term. None of the other Rishonim think that makes a difference. I want it there short term, so that's a bosses. Here we're using temporary in the sense that I don't want it there at all. From my point of view, I'd be happy if it was over there and didn't have to go through the stages. Just we live in a world of space-time continuum, and you live in a world where you can't get to this end of the table without going via all the interim spaces. I have no desire for it to be in the interim spaces. It doesn't, from my point of view, there's no will for it to be there whatsoever. It's just a means to get to the end goal. I think that is everyone with me? I think there's a very clear chiluk between the case of the chickens, where I want the chickens there for a short term, but I want them there for that time. Why should that make a difference in Hilchos bosses? For 10 minutes, for an hour, for 2 hours, I want this Katie used as a clambering ledge for the chickens, as opposed to the case of rolling from bed to bed, where I have zero desire for the mace to be on the bed. I'd be perfectly happy if it wasn't on the interim beds. I can only get to the end goal by taking it via that. That's the distinction that's been drawn in there.
I mean, in a sense, you can still argue though, once you do want it on that bed for that short length of time before you move it on to the next bed.
If you couldn't argue that, I wouldn't have had to say this point, and I've had no share to say. You're right. There is a subtlety in the reasoning here. I just think it's a good. I think it's a good chiluk. You're correct. The question is, what does it mean to want something? And in philosophy, they talk about like a primary purpose and a secondary purpose, and so on and so forth. In some levels, I do want it here, because the reality is we live in a physical world where the only way to get there is by going via there. So do I want to be here or not if I'm on my journey from A to B? Yes and no. I'd be very happy if I could jump straight to B and not go via there. But I recognize that I live in a world where I have to go via all the interim spaces. But there is a clear svara to say that where this is just a barrier to getting straight there, it doesn't need to pass through the stages. Passing through is different to temporary. That's the logic. But I'm not saying it's mathematically provable. It's interesting. The BeChammah in his Hakdama. So the BeChammah wrote a commentary on the Rif. That's where we have him. He didn't write directly on the Gemara. He wrote on the Rif, and his introduction. He says all Talmudical reasoning is like that. It's in modern day terminology, we would say it's never deductive logic, it's always inductive logic. In other words, it's always a shikul hadas of weighing things up. It's not, when you're dealing with law and morals and ethics and halachic interpretations on, you're never dealing with mathematical truths where there's no room to argue. You're dealing ultimately with a judgment call. And the judgment call here is that seems to be a reasonable one, is that the temporary can mean two things. It can mean where you want it to be there short term, in which case it is a basis, or where you, as far as you're concerned, you wouldn't like it to be there at all. You just have no choice but to go via there. You're passing through, but you don't want it there, in which case it wouldn't be a basis there. That's a reasonable chiluk. It's not definitive, it's not definite, you could argue, but it's a reasonable chiluk. Yeah.
I thought the logic of BeChammah was actually because it wasn't for the whole of Shabbat. And the principle is not temporary in this. It's got to be there for the whole of Shabbat.
Yeah, you may well be right. Yes, you may well be right there. What defines temporariness is the whole of Shabbat. And as soon as it's not for the whole of Shabbat, it means I'm recognizing it has a Shabbat use. And therefore I'm not making it completely useless. I'm making it limited use because there's several hours of Shabbat not. And yes, that's a very good point also. Yeah, I probably slipped into imprecise language, and I stand corrected. Yeah. Okay, so that's that's really all I want to say for now on bosses. What I'd like us to do is to learn a bit of Rabbi Akiva and then a bit of Rashash together. And then we'll probably run out of time today, and we'll revisit this next week. So Rabbi Akiva is printed on the side of Gemara in Gideon Hashas. The translation of Gideon Hashas actually means notes on the Gemara. It doesn't say it's Rabbi Akiva, but it always is. The Gideon Hashas printed on the side of the Gemara page is always Rabbi Akiva's notes. Rabbi Akiva wrote, like many others did, Chidushim. There's a separate volume that we have here in this library and elsewhere of Chidushim Rabbi Akiva. Those are the dedicated sort of commentary and insights that Rabbi Akiva wrote on Shas, but also in his own Gemara he wrote Gideonis. He wrote notes on the sides of the Gemara, and that was found and published in the format of Gideon Hashas, and it's just often very brief comments of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva here, if I can find it. I hope it's on the side of the Gemara here. Yes, the top horror of Rabbi Akiva, Kipiligi de Leslie, says Rabbi Akiva, Kashali. I don't understand this. Amailo hava hamita atzma the mokum kika o tinuk. Why is it the mitzvah itself? Why can't the mitzvah itself act in place of the loaf of bread or the child? So, sorry, which would be on it? Yes. So Rabbi Akiva always writes in his Gideon Hashas very briefly. The Gemara says that you can't move the mitzvah with the mace on it because you're moving Muktza. Says the Gemara, however, if you put a kikar or a tinuk, a loaf or a child on the mace, then you're on the mitzvah, then you're not just moving Muktza, you're moving non-Muktza also, and therefore it should be allowed because you're moving Muktza and non-Muktza. Now, originally I didn't put the Rabbi Akiva on the source sheet because I wanted to start off by saying, what does this mean? You're moving one or the other, and how does that help that you're moving something else, and what difference does it make, etc., etc. And I wanted to try and deal with this conceptually. as I was preparing for Shiur last night, it became clear to me that actually a good crowbar to crack the sugya open with is this question of Rabbi Kiva, because as we ponder this question, it's going to bring out all the points that really I want to discuss about conceptually what this means. So just to summarize, the Gemara says that if you're not allowed to move Muktza, but if you're moving Muktza and non-Muktza together, then it is allowed, and therefore the kikkar or the tinuk is a solution to this problem. Asks Rabbi Kiva, why then do you need a loaf of bread or a child? You're always moving a bed plus the mace. The bed is not Muktza, it's a bed. The mace is Muktza, it's a mace. Why do you need to add a third element here, put a loaf or a child on it? You're anyway moving Muktza and non-Muktza. So asked Rabbi Kiva. Now, the reason we discussed bosses earlier was because you may be tempted to answer, but the bed's also Muktza because it's a bosses. That can't be, because then the previous Gemara doesn't make sense. So clearly, the bed is not Muktza, as per our previous discussion, Tosfos bosses. But whether you understood the previous discussion or not, whether you like Tosfos or not, the fact is the Gemara says the bed is not Muktza, the mace is Muktza, and nonetheless, you shouldn't be able to move it because you're moving the mace if you hold it sultan and outside as osa, and the solution is to move something else along with it, which is the bread or the tinuk. Ask Rabbi Kiva, for crying out loud, why do you need to add something else on? You're always moving a bed plus a mace. Now, Rabbi Kiva then references a Mogen Avram, which I'm not going to go into today in Shiur. We'll look at it next Shiur. But then his concluding words are, no one mentions this point. The Tzorach Ian Godel, this is a great mystery. This needs an enormous amount of research. Rabbi Kiva takes this question very, very seriously. By the way, whenever we learn Rishonim Achronim, there is a living tradition as to how precisely they chose their words, to what degree we should be medayik their words. And pick up on inferences. So, for example, Rashi, we know every word is precious because Rashi wrote very, very briefly, and really every word of Rashi is very precise. We know the Rambam, for example, focused very much on the structure of how he ordered his work. The Ramban, I don't think anyone's ever claimed that. The Ramban is a pillar of learning, but I don't think anyone ever claimed that like the structural order of his work is the different. He wrote free flow on the order of the Gemara, on the Chumash, or whatever it may be. So each Rishon, you have to know how they wrote. With Rabbi Kiva, when he wrote Tzorach Ian, he meant it needs research. When he wrote Tzorach Ian Godel, he meant it needs a lot of research. I consider this a really problematic matter. So with Kiva, we sort of, it's known that he chose with care the language he used. So he considers this a very, very weighty question. Even in his scribbled notes, we take it very seriously. These are scribbled notes and it's taken very seriously. The Talmidim of Rabbi Kiva testified that he wrote these notes with care. That's why they ended up printed on the side of the on the side of the Gemara. And sometimes he won't write even Tzorach Ian Godel, because Tzorach Ian says it needs research, and there's an answer out there, and it needs research to work out, a lot of research to exactly fine-tune the answer. But sometimes he says it's a tamer or something that's even stronger, so it remains a mystery in my mind. So Rabbi Kiva has taken, the language of Rabbi Kiva in this instance has taken, so we have a living tradition. I mean, it wasn't so long ago, it was a couple of hundred years ago. We have a living tradition that if you wrote Tzorach Ian, he meant one thing. If you wrote Tzorach Ian Godel, he meant it was a great research. Either way, just to summarize, the Gemara says that you can't move the mace because it's Muktza. However, if you're moving Muktza and non-Muktza, such as the kikkar or the tinuk, you can move it. Also, Rabbi Kiva, you're always moving Muktza and non-Muktza because you're moving the bed. So that's Rabbi Kiva's question. What I'd like to do is just learn a Rashash together who answers this question. And then we'll probably stop for today, and in Hashem next week maybe look at some more details on this. So I'm sorry that I only put the Rashash on the WhatsApp group, but for those of you who have the full Gemara, you'll find the Rashash on the back. Just to mention, by the way, a bit of history. So the Rashash is a very late commentary on the Gemara. He writes, by the way, remarkably every single daf in Shas. So there's not a single daf in Shas that doesn't have the Rashash on. The Rashash lived in Vilna. He was a wealthy individual. He was blessed with significant resources. He was a businessman with Shmuel Strassen. He was about the same time as Rabbi Zobin, that sort of era. That's the time in history we're talking about. He assembled a library, which was the pride and joy of Vilna. He had a son of Masechet Shabbat. He is Shmuel Strassen. He had a son of Masechet Shabbat. He was also Talmid Chacham, who was flirted with Haskalah. The son of Masechet Shabbat was someone on the border between traditional scholarship and Haskalah. Just giving an indication of how times have changed. he's a bibliophile and was blessed with resources and a foreign collector, both the father and the son, and they set up a library in Vilna, which was the pride and joy of the Vilna community. It was airy and light and had tables and massive collection of Sforim. And at that library, everyone rubbed shoulders, from academics to traditional Talmidei Chachamim to Maskilim to reformers. Everyone, this library was a neutral zone where, like a watering hole in the jungle, where everyone assembled and rubbed shoulders. And it was the pride and joy of Vilna. And it had in it 2,000 to 3,000 books. That gives you an indication of how times have moved on, because 2,000, 3,000 books is nothing. Between the two bottom address here, we have that number. And then on my at home, I probably have 1,000 Sforim, and on my Muktza I stopped buying Sforim because I have Muktza Chachma. You have 60,000 Sforim. So it just gives you an indication of how times have moved on. But in the whole of Europe, people came to this library in Vilna, which is the pride and joy of the Vilna community, for what nowadays would be considered a nice base medrash collection, but not like a staggering collection at all. Okay, so Shas wrote on every Omid in Shas. He's not considered, by the way, to have the weight of a full Achra in the Shas. In other words, he's not a weighty halachic opinion. But we need to say this, his comments are always thought-provoking and important. But he's not considered to have the stature of a sort of a posek or a senior basic. So let's have a quick look at what the Shas says on this. Beginning on Shas Hikshe. In the Gideon Hashas, that means Rabbi Kivegi asks, why can't the bed act as in place of the loaf of bread itself is not Muktza? And it appears to me, the hard to tnan esachai b'mitzah potter, af al mitzah atzmei, af al mitzah even on the mitzah, shamitzah to fail because the mitzah is toffel to it. So he says as follows: the halacha is that if you carry a living person, you are potter. It's osa, but potter. Why are you potter? Because a living person shifts themselves to make themselves easier to be carried. They cooperate with the carrying process. They're not a dead weight, quite literally. And therefore, they are not just a passive object being carrying, about which the Torah law of carrying objects on Shabbos applies. They are participatory in it. And therefore, min haTorah, not chayiv, you're not chayiv for carrying a living person. Now, sorry, carrying, nothing to do with Muktza. Sorry, apologies. I should have made this clear. Sorry. The Shash is going to make an analogy to a completely different halacha. Yeah. Okay, the halacha is as follows. Sorry, apologies. On Shabbos, we're not allowed to carry an object from Rishus HaYachid to a Rishus HaRabim. However, that's where you carry a passive object, not where you carry a chai. That's the halachic background, because a chai participates with the carrying. They're not just a passive object. A dead weight, they are themselves part of the carrying process. And therefore, one way of simplifying the story would be, it's as if two people are carrying something together. Neither of them is doing the melacha fully by themselves. And therefore, you're not chai. There's other ways of conceptualizing the melacha, but for our purposes, something like that is enough. In brief, carrying on Shabbos from Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaRabim means carrying an object. If I carry a living being where they participate in it, that isn't the derisa of carrying. Now, here we get to the Rishash's analogy. What happens if I carry a living person on a stretcher, on a bed? So this is a machlokus later on, and the svara to allow you to carry, why on earth would you be allowed to carry if they're on a bed? The living person isn't a dead weight, but the bed is a classic object. Why shouldn't I be able to carry it? The basis of those who allow carrying even, or to say you're not chayiv if you carry a dead body on a bed, is because the bed is toffel to the living person. It's only a means of carrying the living person. It therefore doesn't have its own significance as an entity in its own right. So the Shash is going to argue by analogy, therefore, that the bed is toffel to the living person or the dead person that's on it. The bed is the less important thing, it's the means. The body is the more important means. Therefore, if we move back to Hilchos Muktza, the whole logic of why I can move and Muktza and non-Muktza at the same time is because my action is ascribed both to the Muktza item and to the non-Muktza item, both of which I am carrying. However, where I'm carrying a stretcher with the dead body on it, the dead body is toffel, is insignificant, is nullified with respect to the dead body. Sorry, the mitzvah is nullified as insignificant with respect to the dead body, and therefore my action of moving the Muktza is ascribed to the dead body, not to the stretcher, and therefore it wouldn't help, as opposed to the kikkar or the tinuk, who are completely independent and therefore is considered moving a non-Muktza item and a Muktza item together, and therefore that would be allowed. So argues the Rishash. So just to summarize, Rabbi Kiva Eger said, you see in the Gemara that you're allowed to move Muktza and non-Muktza together, such as the mace and the loaf of bread. In that case, you're moving the mace and the kikkar and the mitzvah. So why do you need the loaf of bread? Just suffice it to say that you've got the mitzvah. So the Rishash, I want to draw an analogy from a completely other area of halacha. When you carry a living body out from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, you're not chayav because it's a living body. What about the bed? There's an opinion in the Gemara that you're not chayav for the bed either, because your carrying action is ascribed to the more chashuv thing, and the other one is toffel, it's just insignificant and nullified. And therefore, over here, too, the bed is toffel, is insignificant and nullified with respect to the dead body, and therefore it wouldn't be enough to save you from Muktza, because my primary act is that of moving Muktza, and the bed is insignificant. But if I put a child or a kikkar there, which is an independent entity, an independent object, I'm moving that, and therefore the Muktza doesn't apply to that. So that's a summary of the Rishash. In Yetz Hashem, next year we'll relook at the Rishash to read it inside, and then we'll debate and discuss what this all means and what this tells us about the logic of the Gemara. But this is the crowbar that I wanted to use to crack open the sugya of what's going on over here. Okay, and apologies again, Jeffrey and Henry, for the mix-up with the link. Thank you very much. I'll make the recording available either way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.